My name is Samuel Jones, and for the last 22 years, my life has been a conversation with yeast and grain. At 54, I was the head brewmaster at Northwood Brewery, a title that felt as natural and comfortable as my worn-in leather boots. My office wasn't a sterile room with a desk, but the heart of the brewhouse itself, a cathedral of gleaming stainless steel, filled with the sweet, malty aroma of boiling wort and the earthy, citrus scent of hops. I didn't just work at Northwood, I was its soul. I had created every single beer in our portfolio, from our flagship Ridgeback Amber Ale, which had won a gold medal at the Great American Beer Festival, to the seasonal stouts that people lined up for on the first cold day of autumn. The brewery was founded by a man named Arthur Miller, a kind, gruff old-timer who had hired me when I was just a passionate home brewer with a dream. He and I had built Northwood from the ground up. He was the business mind, and I was the palate, the artist. We shared a simple philosophy: make honest, balanced, high-quality beer. No shortcuts, no gimmicks. Arthur had been my mentor and my friend, and for 2 decades, we'd had a comfortable, unspoken understanding. When he was ready to hang up his hat, I would be given the opportunity to lead the brewery's legacy forward. He wasn't just my boss, he was my partner in craft. The change came not with a bang, but with a slow, sad fade. Arthur's health had been declining, and last spring, he'd finally made the decision to retire. But instead of the succession plan we'd discussed for years, he'd announced that his son, Kevin, would be taking over as CEO. Kevin was 30 years old, with a freshly minted marketing degree, a wardrobe of expensive, trendy clothes, and absolutely no knowledge of or interest in the painstaking process of brewing beer. He saw Northwood not as a craft brewery, but as a beverage brand with untapped market potential. The first few months were a tense, awkward transition. Kevin would walk through the brewhouse, scrolling on his phone, occasionally asking questions that revealed his profound ignorance. "Why does this beer have to sit in the tank for 6 weeks?" he'd ask, pointing at my award-winning lager. "That's valuable tank space. Can't we speed that up?" I would patiently explain the science of lagering, of cold conditioning, of how flavor develops over time. He would listen with a look of bored impatience, as if I were a history professor explaining an irrelevant, outdated tradition. The day the future became painfully clear was the day Kevin called a meeting with me and the new brand consultant he had hired. The consultant was a man named Bryce, a slick, fast-talking guy who used phrases like disrupting the flavor profile and leveraging social media optics. "Sam," Kevin began, with a tone of forced enthusiasm, "Bryce and I have been analyzing the market data, and we feel that our core lineup is a bit dated. It's not speaking to the younger demographic." Bryce chimed in, pointing to a colorful PowerPoint slide. "The data shows explosive growth in the hazy IPA and pastry stout categories. We're talking about beers that are heavily fruited, adjunct heavy, and, most importantly, highly Instagrammable. Your Ridgeback Amber is a great beer, a classic. But it's not a beer that's going to get 1,000 likes on Instagram." I looked at them, a feeling of cold dread seeping into my bones. "Kevin," I said slowly, trying to keep my voice even, "we built our reputation on making classic, well-balanced beers. People trust us for our quality and consistency. Chasing trends is a fool's game. Those hazy IPAs have the shelf stability of milk, and pastry stouts are often just cloyingly sweet gimmick beers." Kevin smiled a tight, condescending smile. "I appreciate your traditionalist perspective, Sam. But we can't afford to be a museum. We need to be a brand that's part of the current conversation, which is why we've decided to make some changes to the production schedule." He then laid out the plan. They were going to cut the production of my lager by 75% to free up tank space. They wanted me to start developing a series of new beers based on Bryce's market research: a mango habanero sour, a triple dry hopped IPA with lactose, and a stout aged on coffee and donuts. It was a direct assault on everything I had built. "And one more thing," Kevin said, almost as an afterthought. "We're going to be reformulating the recipe for the Ridgeback Amber." I stared at him, speechless. The Ridgeback Amber was my masterpiece, a perfectly balanced recipe I had spent years perfecting. It was the beer that had put us on the map. "Reformulating?" I finally managed to say. "Just some minor cost-saving tweaks," Bryce said smoothly. "We've identified a cheaper domestic hop variety that is functionally similar to the German hops you're using. And we can replace a portion of the malt bill with corn sugar to lower the cost of goods. The average consumer won't even notice the difference." Every word was a dagger. He was proposing to gut my best creation, to replace its heart with cheap filler, all in the name of a few extra percentage points on a profit margin. The average consumer might not notice, but I would. And the loyal customers who had been drinking my beer for 20 years would absolutely notice. No, I said, my voice quiet but firm. Absolutely not. I will not put my name on a beer made with corn sugar. Kevin's friendly facade finally dropped. A look of cold annoyance crossed his face. Sam, he said, his voice losing its warmth. This isn't a discussion. It's the new direction of the company. Your job is to execute that direction. If you're not on board, perhaps you're no longer the right fit for the future we're building. The threat was unmistakable. I looked from Kevin's entitled, arrogant face to Bryce's slick, soulless smile. They weren't brewers. They were brand managers. They didn't understand that the soul of a brewery isn't in its marketing plan or its profit margins. It's in the integrity of its recipes. And they were about to tear that soul out. I walked out of that meeting, the sweet smell of the brew house suddenly smelling like a funeral home. The brewery I had loved was already dead. It just didn't know it yet. The days that followed the meeting were a slow-motion nightmare. The familiar, comforting aromas of my brew house now seemed to mock me. I'd walk past the towering stainless steel fermenters, the vessels where I had spent 2 decades coaxing magic from the simplest ingredients, and feel like a ghost haunting my own life. Kevin and Bryce, a duo I privately started calling the Brand Boys, began to implement their new vision with the zealous ignorance of true believers. Memos circulated with new, cringe-worthy marketing slogans. Northwood, a vibe in every can. The sacred, quiet hum of the brewery was now punctuated by the loud, upbeat pop music Bryce insisted on playing, claiming it improved team morale. It did not. My team, the dedicated brewers and cellarmen I had trained and mentored over the years, looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and confusion. They were soldiers, waiting for their general to give them orders, but the general was now a prisoner of war in his own command tent. Maria, my sharp and talented assistant brewer, a woman whose palate I trusted as much as my own, looked at me with particular despair. "He can't be serious, Sam," she'd whisper, after Kevin had walked through asking why the dry hopping couldn't be done in half the time. "He doesn't understand the first thing about isomerization." I could only offer a weary shrug, a gesture that felt like a betrayal of every lesson I had ever taught her. The tangible symbol of my defeat arrived on a pallet a week later. Large, nondescript bags of corn sugar and boxes of pelletized, generic American hops. Kevin had personally sent me the purchase order to sign. I stared at the paper, at the clinical list of ingredients that were meant to replace the heart of my Ridgeback Amber Ale. Signing it felt like signing a death warrant. I walked into Kevin's sterile, minimalist office, the purchase order in my hand. "Kevin," I said, trying one last time, "this is a mistake. Let me prove it to you. I'll brew a small 5-barrel pilot batch with these new ingredients. We'll put it up against the original Ridgeback in a blind tasting with the entire staff. Let the beer speak for itself." He leaned back in his expensive office chair, a look of bored indulgence on his face. "Fine, Sam," he said with a sigh. "If it will make you feel better, go ahead. Have your little science experiment." I spent the next week brewing that batch of beer. It was the most soulless, joyless brew of my entire career. I followed my own recipe, but swapped out the ingredients as instructed. The rich, bready aroma of German Munich malt was replaced by a thin, one-dimensional sweetness. The noble, floral scent of the Hallertau hops was bulldozed by the brash, piney aroma of the cheap substitute. The resulting beer was beer. It was amber-colored. It had alcohol. It fizzed. But it had no soul. It was a hollow echo of the original, a soulless imposter. We held the blind tasting in the tap room. I poured 2 small glasses for each of the 15 employees, one labeled A, the original, and one labeled B, the new formula. Even Kevin and Bryce participated. The result was unequivocal. 14 out of 15 people, including most of the non-production staff, chose A as the superior beer. They used words like more complex, smoother, cleaner finish. The only person who chose B was Bryce. I looked at Kevin, a flicker of hope in my chest. "The results are clear," I said. "The quality difference is undeniable." Kevin glanced at the results sheet and then shrugged, a gesture of supreme indifference. "It's not about better, Sam," he said, his voice laced with condescension. "It's about good enough. It's an amber ale. Bryce says our new marketing campaign, which focuses on the Northwood lifestyle, will more than make up for any subtle flavor variations. The cost savings on this recipe are significant. We're moving forward with Formula B." And that was it. The hope in my chest died, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. He didn't care about the beer. He didn't care about the quality, the craft, or the legacy. He was a brand manager who had inherited a factory. The beer itself was incidental. That evening, I knew I couldn't fight this battle from the inside any longer. I called David, my head cellarman, and Maria to the quiet, cool barrel aging room, the one place in the brewery the brand boys never ventured. I told them what had happened at the tasting, about Kevin's final decision. David, a quiet man who had worked at Northwood for 18 years, shook his head in disgust. "It's a disgrace," he said, his voice a low rumble. Arthur would be turning in his grave. Maria's eyes were blazing with a furious, youthful idealism. "So what do we do, Sam?" she asked. "We can't make that swill. It's an insult to everything you've taught us." "I don't know what we are going to do yet," I said honestly. "But I know what I have to do. I can't stay. I won't be the man who oversees the destruction of this brewery's reputation." I looked at them, my two most trusted colleagues. "My fight with Kevin is my own. I don't expect either of you to risk your jobs over it." "This isn't just your fight, Sam," Maria said immediately. "We're a team. Where you go, we go. I'd rather scrub floors at a real brewery than be an assistant brewer at a factory that makes beer-flavored soda." David nodded his silent, firm agreement. The loyalty of these two good people was a small, warm light in the encroaching darkness. The next day, I made a phone call. I called Isabel Rossi, the owner of a group of the most respected craft beer bars and restaurants in the state. She was one of our oldest clients, a woman with a famously discerning palate and a fierce loyalty to quality. I asked to meet her for a coffee, telling her it was a matter of some urgency regarding her Northwood account. We met at one of her gastropubs before it opened for the day. I didn't gossip. I didn't complain about Kevin. I simply and professionally laid out the facts. I told her about the upcoming mandated recipe change for the Ridgeback Amber and several of our other core beers, detailing the ingredient substitutions. I told her that, as the brewmaster, I could no longer stand behind the quality of the product she would be receiving. Isabel listened, her expression growing more and more grim. "So, the boy wonder is going to turn my favorite amber ale into a cheap imitation," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Sam, I appreciate your honesty. My reputation is built on the quality of the beer I serve. This is deeply concerning. I felt it was my professional duty to inform you," I said. She was quiet for a moment, swirling the dregs of her espresso. Then she looked at me, her eyes sharp and analytical. "So, what's next for you? You're not going to stay and watch him burn the place to the ground, are you?" "No," I said. "I'm not." "Good," she said, a decisive nod. She leaned forward, her voice dropping. "Sam, I'm going to tell you something. For years, my partners and I have talked about investing in a small, quality-focused brewery, one that aligns with our values. The only thing that has ever stopped us is finding the right brewmaster, someone with the experience and the reputation to be a sure thing, someone like you." The air in the empty pub suddenly felt charged with electricity. "If you ever decide to go out on your own," she continued, "if you decide to build something new, my taps will be the first in line waiting for your beer. And I know a few people who would be very interested in investing in a sure thing. Think about it." I walked out of that pub and into the bright afternoon sun, her words echoing in my mind. The anger and despair that had been my constant companions for weeks began to recede, replaced by a fragile, terrifying, and exhilarating new thought. A new brewery, my own brewery. The idea, once an impossible fantasy, was suddenly a tangible, achievable possibility. Kevin hadn't just pushed me out, he had pushed me toward a new beginning. Isabel Rossi's offer echoed in my mind for days, a constant, tantalizing hum beneath the surface of my dreary new reality at Northwood. It was a lifeline, a key to a door I had never thought I'd have the courage to even approach. But it was also terrifying. I was 54 years old. I had a mortgage, a retirement account that was finally looking healthy, and a life built on the foundation of a steady, reliable paycheck. Starting over at my age wasn't just a risk, it was a leap into a financial abyss. Could I really walk away from 2 decades of security to gamble on a dream? The answer came to me not in a moment of grand revelation, but during a mundane brewing session. I was being forced to oversee the first official, full-scale batch of the new, reformulated Ridgeback Amber. As I watched the thin, lifeless wort flow into the kettle, as I dumped in the cheap, piney hops and the bags of corn sugar, I felt a profound sense of self-loathing. It felt like I was personally poisoning my own creation. This wasn't brewing, it was manufacturing. And in that moment, the fear of the unknown became less potent than the certainty of a slow, soul-crushing compromise. The risk of failure was less terrifying than the guarantee of becoming a man who no longer respected his own work. My decision was made. That evening, I called Maria and David to the barrel-aging room again. This time, I wasn't there to commiserate. I was there to recruit. I laid out Isabel's proposal, her offer to connect us with investors and to be our first and most important customer. This is not a sure thing, I told them, my voice low and serious. It's a huge gamble. There's no guaranteed paycheck, no benefits, no pension. We'd be starting from zero. I will not hold it against either of you if you decide the risk is too great. You both have families, responsibilities. Maria didn't hesitate. Sam, I didn't get into brewing to manage sugar additions for a marketing department, she said, her eyes bright with defiance. I got into it to learn from you, to make beer that has integrity. If you're building something new, I want to be there, hammering in the first nails. I'm in, 100%. I then looked at David. He was older, more cautious, a man who valued stability. He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the oak barrels that lined the room, barrels he had tended with such care for years. My grandfather was a carpenter, he said finally, his voice soft. He used to say that a man is only as good as the things he builds. For the last few weeks, this place, we haven't been building anything. We've been demolishing. I'd rather build a shack with a solid foundation than keep a room in a palace that's about to collapse. I'm with you, Sam. The relief and gratitude I felt were immense. We were no longer just a disgruntled team. We were partners. True to her word, Isabel connected us with a small, local investment group, a firm that specialized in funding artisan food and beverage startups. They were former chefs, winemakers, and entrepreneurs who valued quality and a good story. Our meeting was set for the following week. We spent every spare moment preparing, our secret sessions at my house now filled with the frantic energy of a startup. We weren't just complaining about Kevin anymore. We were building his replacement. We decided on a name for our new venture, Cornerstone Brewing Company. It was perfect. It spoke to our philosophy, a return to the foundational principles of the craft, a solid, reliable presence in the community. The day of the pitch, the three of us sat in a modern, sunlit boardroom. We weren't there to beg. We were there to present an opportunity. I went first. I didn't talk about profit margins or market trends. I talked about the soul of beer. I spoke of the art of balancing malt and hops, of the patience required for proper lagering, of my unwavering commitment to quality. I was the master craftsman, the guarantee that the product itself would be unimpeachable. I was the sure thing Isabel had mentioned. Maria went next, and she was brilliant. She presented a smart, lean plan for innovation. She spoke of a small, 5-barrel pilot system that would run alongside our main production, a space for creativity. Cornerstone won't just be about perfecting the classics, she argued. It will also be a laboratory. We'll create small experimental batches, a perfectly crafted Pilsner 1 month, a complex Belgian quad the next. We will engage with the beer connoisseurs, the enthusiasts who are always looking for something new, but who are tired of gimmicks. We will innovate without ever compromising our core principles. She represented the future, the creative energy. David concluded the presentation. He laid out the operational plan with a quiet, irrefutable competence. He had spreadsheets detailing equipment costs, sourcing plans for the best grains and hops, a quality control regimen that was stricter than any health department regulation, and a lean, efficient distribution model. He was the nuts and bolts, the guarantee that the business itself would be as well crafted as the beer. When we finished, the lead investor, a sharp woman named Elizabeth, looked at us. It's a solid plan, she said, but the craft beer market is saturated. Northwood Brewery is an established brand with massive market penetration. How do you compete with that? We don't, I said simply. We're not competing with the Northwood that exists today. We are competing with the memory of what Northwood used to be. The current ownership is in the process of systematically alienating its most loyal customers. They are creating a vacuum in the market for high-quality, classic, reliable beer. We aren't just building a brewery. We are providing a refuge for those abandoned customers. The investors conferred for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Elizabeth looked at us and smiled. "Gentlemen, Maria," she said, "welcome to the brewing industry. Let's build a cornerstone." We walked out of that building feeling 10 feet tall. The dream had a budget. The plan had a green light. The final, ugly confirmation that we had made the right decision came the next day at Northwood. Kevin called a full staff meeting. He announced with great fanfare the launch of their new innovation series. and the first beer in that series would be a mango sriracha firecracker sour. To make tank space for this new product, he was officially, effective immediately, discontinuing production of my classic, award-winning Doppelbock. He was killing my most decorated, beloved creation, a beer that took 3 months to properly lager, a beer that represented the pinnacle of my craft, and replacing it with a ridiculous, gimmicky beverage designed to be a spectacle on Instagram. It was the ultimate desecration of my legacy. I looked over at Maria and David. They met my gaze, and in their eyes, I saw the same cold, hard resolve that I felt in my own heart. Any lingering doubts, any sentimental attachment to the place we had called home for so long, vanished in that instant. We were no longer employees of Northwood Brewery. We were the founders of Cornerstone Brewing Company, and we were about to start building. The meeting where Kevin announced the death of my Doppelbock was the final severing of a long-dead cord of loyalty. There was no more debate, no more hope of salvaging the soul of Northwood Brewery. There was only the cold, clear path of action. That evening, the three of us met at my house, not as disgruntled employees, but as the founding partners of a company that, until now, had only existed on paper. The time for secret planning was over. "We do it tomorrow morning," I said, my voice resolute. All three of us. Together. We walk in, we hand him our letters, and we walk out. No arguments, no negotiation. Maria nodded, her eyes blazing. A clean break. "He'll be blindsided," David said, a hint of grim satisfaction in his tone. "He thinks we're just going to roll over." The next morning, we walked into the brewery together. The air was thick with the cloying, artificial scent of a mango puree test batch that Bryce was overseeing. It was a sickening perfume, a fragrant announcement of the brewery's new, vapid direction. We bypassed the brew house and walked straight to Kevin's office. He was on a video call, a large whiteboard behind him, covered in marketing buzzwords. He looked up, annoyed by the interruption. He muted his microphone. "What is it?" "I'm in the middle of a branding synergy call." I stepped forward and placed 3 envelopes on his polished desk. "Kevin," I said, my voice devoid of emotion, "this is the resignation of myself, David, and Maria, effective immediately." Kevin stared at the envelopes, then at our 3 faces. A slow, arrogant smirk spread across his face. He actually chuckled. "Wow," he said, shaking his head. "So this is it. The old guard is making a stand. Over a bock beer, you're all really quitting at the same time?" "We are," I confirmed. He leaned back in his chair, the picture of unconcerned authority. "Okay, well, don't let the door hit you on the way out. Honestly, this probably saves me some time. We're moving in a new, more dynamic direction anyway, and it's better to have a team that's fully on board. Consider your 2 weeks' notice waived. You can pick up your final paychecks from HR." He unmuted his microphone and turned back to his video call, dismissing the 3 people who represented the entirety of his brewery's institutional knowledge and experience as if he were shooing away a fly. We didn't say another word. We turned and walked out. As we passed through the brew house, the rest of the production staff stopped what they were doing, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning horror. They knew what our departure meant. I made eye contact with the young cellarman I had trained for the past 2 years. He gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod of solidarity. The Brand Boys had bought the building, but they hadn't bought the loyalty of the people inside it. Walking out of the front door of Northwood Brewery for the last time was one of the most painful and liberating moments of my life. I was leaving behind 22 years of my life's work. Every tank, every pipe, every scuff on the concrete floor held a memory. But as the door clicked shut behind me, the weight of the last 6 months of compromise and humiliation lifted from my shoulders. I was free. The news of our mass resignation hit the local craft beer scene like a lightning strike. By noon, my phone was buzzing incessantly. Bar owners, suppliers, fellow brewers from across the state, they all wanted to know what had happened. The story that Kevin and Bryce tried to spin a brief sanitized statement about creative differences and a new chapter for the brewery was immediately drowned out by the truth that spread through the grapevine. The first tangible sign of our new future came the next day. I got a call from a local farmer who supplied us with the specialty malted barley for my award-winning stout. "Sam, I just heard the news," he said, his voice gruff. "I just got off the phone with that new kid running the place. He tried to cancel our contract and asked if I could sell him a cheaper, 6-row barley instead. I told him to go pound sand. My barley is for real brewers. So, my question is, where are you setting up your new shop? Because my harvest is reserved for you." That conversation was the first of many. Our reputation, the relationships we had built over decades, was our real asset. It was something Kevin, with all his marketing data, could never understand. We found our new home a week later. It was a dusty, cavernous warehouse in a semi-abandoned industrial park on the edge of town, a place that had once housed a textile mill. The roof leaked, the electricity was ancient, and it was filled with the ghosts of forgotten industry. But it had high ceilings, a solid concrete floor, and most importantly, it was ours. We stood in the middle of the vast, empty space, the three of us. The scale of the task ahead of us, both daunting and exhilarating. We had the funding from our investors. We had the support of our suppliers. Now, we had to build a brewery from scratch. That evening, as we were taking measurements, a car pulled up. It was Isabel Rossi. She stepped out, impeccably dressed as always, and looked around the dilapidated space with a critical eye. "Well," she said with a wry smile, "it's got potential. Needs a bit of work." "A bit," I agreed. She handed me an envelope. "This is the signed contract," she said. "A commitment for a full year of 6 dedicated cornerstone taps at all 10 of my locations. The day you brew your first batch, you already have your biggest customer." It was an incredible gesture of faith, a lifeline that guaranteed us a revenue stream before we had even ordered our first fermenter. As she was leaving, a courier on a motorcycle pulled up and handed me a different kind of envelope, this one from a high-end law firm. It was a cease and desist letter from Northwood's new corporate lawyers, full of vague threats about non-compete clauses and the intellectual property of the beer recipes. I read it and laughed, a real, genuine laugh. "He's threatening to sue me for the recipes he just butchered," I said, showing it to Maria and David. "Let him try," David said with a dismissive wave. "He doesn't own the way you think, Sam. He doesn't own your palate." He was right. Kevin could keep the name. He could keep the building. But he had let the soul of the place walk out the door. After the lawyer's letter, there was no turning back, no second thoughts. I looked around our empty warehouse, at my 2 trusted partners. The road ahead was long and difficult, but we were free. I picked up a piece of chalk from a toolbox and knelt down on the dusty concrete floor. "Okay," I said, a grin spreading across my face. "The hot liquor tank goes here." I drew a large circle, the first line in the blueprint of our new life. We were finally building something that was truly ours. The 6 months that followed were the most grueling and deeply satisfying of my life. Building a brewery from the dusty floor of an abandoned warehouse is a relentless, unforgiving process. Our lives became a blur of concrete dust, welding sparks, and the endless, maddening details of plumbing, electrical wiring, and zoning permits. The 3 of us were no longer just a brewer, a cellar master, and an assistant. We were now project managers, amateur electricians, and full-time laborers. Our days started before sunrise and ended long after sunset, our bodies aching with a physical exhaustion I hadn't felt since I was a young man. David, my quiet, steady cellar master, revealed a hidden talent for managing contractors with a firm, unshakable calm. He navigated the labyrinth of city permits and building codes, fought with suppliers over delivery dates, and kept our budget on a razor-thin leash. Maria, with her boundless energy and scientific mind, designed our small but state-of-the-art quality control lab from scratch, sourcing second-hand equipment and meticulously planning our yeast management program. I was in my element, chalking out the schematics for the brewhouse on the floor, overseeing the installation of the glycol lines, and arguing with the welders about the precise angle of a pipe fitting. We were a well-oiled machine, fueled by cheap pizza, black coffee, and a shared obsessive vision. There were setbacks that tested our resolve. A crucial shipment of fermentation tanks from a fabricator in Germany was delayed by 2 weeks, threatening our entire production timeline. A sudden torrential rainstorm revealed a leak in the roof we hadn't known about, flooding the area where we had just laid the new sloped trench drains. In those moments, staring at a new, expensive problem, the temptation to despair was immense. But we would look at each other, take a deep breath, and get back to work. We'd patch the roof ourselves. We'd renegotiate the timeline. We were too committed to fail. The most beautiful day was the day the new brewhouse arrived. The massive, gleaming stainless steel tanks were lifted by a crane through a bay door we had to cut into the side of the building. As the mash tun, the boil kettle, and the fermenters were carefully lowered into place, the dusty warehouse was finally transformed. It was no longer just a building. It was a brewery. It was our brewery. I ran my hand over the cold, smooth steel of the mash tun, and for the first time, the full reality of what we were doing hit me. We were actually going to make beer here. While we were building, The institution we had left behind was actively dismantling itself. I got a call one night from a young brewer I'd trained who was still working at Northwood. He sounded miserable. "Sam, you wouldn't believe it," he said, his voice low, as if he were afraid of being overheard. "The new Ridgeback is a disaster. The customers hate it. The forums are calling it corny and thin. And the mango sriracha sour. Sam, it's undrinkable. We had to dump half the batch because it started a secondary fermentation in the cans. Kevin is blaming the production staff, but we're just following the recipe he approved." I felt a quiet, somber vindication. It wasn't just about the cheap ingredients. Kevin and Bryce had failed to understand that a brewery is a living, breathing organism. It requires a deep, intuitive understanding that cannot be learned from a marketing textbook. They had ripped out the heart of the place, and now they were surprised that the body was dying. Our first brew day was a sacred, momentous occasion. Our ingredients had arrived the day before. Pallets of the finest Maris Otter malt from England, sacks of fragrant German hops, the very ingredients I had been told were no longer cost-effective. The air in the brewhouse was filled with the promise of creation. We decided our first beer, the one that would announce our arrival, would be a new flagship, the Cornerstone Pale Ale. It was my own recipe, one I had been perfecting in my mind for years, a perfectly balanced modern American pale ale with a clean malt backbone and a bright citrusy hop character. It was to be our statement of purpose. A beer that was both innovative and timeless, accessible but deeply complex. As the first shovelful of crushed malt hit the hot water in the mash tun, the brewhouse filled with the sweet, comforting aroma of porridge and baking bread. It was the best smell in the world, the smell of life and possibility. The three of us worked in a state of focused, joyful harmony. The day was a blur of activity, monitoring temperatures, adding hops to the boiling wort, running quality checks in Maria's new lab. It was a flawless brew. As the final, cooled wort was transferred into the waiting fermenter and we pitched the yeast, a profound sense of accomplishment settled over us. We had done it. Cornerstone Brewing Company had officially created its first beer. But we weren't finished. The next day, we brewed our second batch. This one was for us. It was my classic Doppelbock, the very beer Kevin had discontinued, the one he had called a waste of tank space. As I mashed in the dark, rich Munich malts, it felt like an act of reclamation, of resurrecting a dear old friend. This beer wouldn't be for sale for months, not until it had properly lagered and aged. It was a testament to our patience, a quiet promise to ourselves that we would never take the shortcuts that had become the new religion at Northwood. That evening, the three of us stood in the cavernous, unfinished space that would one day be our tap room. The brewery was no longer silent. From the sealed fermenters came the soft, gentle bubbling of active fermentation, the sound of yeast turning sugar into alcohol, the sound of our creation coming to life. We were bone-tired, covered in dust and wort, but we had never been happier. David pulled out a bottle of expensive Belgian beer he had been saving for a special occasion. We didn't have any glasses, so we passed the bottle between us, taking swigs of the complex, celebratory brew. "To the Cornerstone," David said, raising the bottle. "To the Cornerstone," Maria and I echoed. We stood there in the fading light, the quiet bubbling of our own beer in the tanks, the only music we needed. We had laid the foundation, and now, the living, breathing heart of our brewery was finally beginning to beat. We were just waiting for it to be ready to share with the world. The 6 weeks it took for our first batch of Cornerstone Pale Ale to ferment and condition were the longest 6 weeks of my life. It was a period of frantic, hopeful activity. We worked tirelessly to finish the tap room, transforming the cavernous industrial space into a warm, inviting hall with a long, polished oak bar and sturdy communal tables. We hired a small, passionate staff. We finalized our distribution agreements. Every day was a step closer to the moment of truth. Our grand opening was on a crisp Saturday in October. We had no marketing budget to speak of, relying only on word of mouth and a few posts on social media. I was terrified no one would show up. By the time we were ready to open the doors at noon, a line had formed down the block. It was a humbling, overwhelming sight. There were old, loyal Northwood customers I hadn't seen in months, local chefs and restaurant owners, fellow brewers from across the state, and curious neighbors. They weren't just here for a new beer. They were here to support a story they believed in. Isabel Rossi stood at the front of the line. I insisted that she have the first pint. My hand was shaking slightly as I pulled the tap handle for the very first time. The Cornerstone Pale Ale poured into the glass, a beautiful, brilliant gold with a thick, rocky white head. I slid it across the bar to her. She held it up to the light, inhaled its bright citrusy aroma, and took a long, thoughtful sip. She set the glass down, a slow, genuine smile spreading across her face. She looked at me and gave a single, decisive nod. It was all the validation I needed. The day was a roaring success. The tap room was filled with the sound of laughter and conversation, the happy hum of a community coming together. The feedback on the beer was everything I had hoped for. People loved its balance, its clean finish, its undeniable quality. They were tasting the difference that real ingredients and patient craftsmanship made. By the end of the night, we had sold out of every last drop of the pale ale. We were exhausted, exhilarated, and officially in business. A year later, the memory of that first day felt like a distant, cherished photograph. Cornerstone Brewing was no longer a scrappy startup. It was a thriving, respected institution. We had won 2 gold medals at the State Beer Festival, one for our pale ale and, most satisfyingly, one for my Doppelbock. We had expanded our production twice to keep up with the demand. Our beers were on tap at every decent bar and restaurant in the region. Maria's experimental pilot batches had become legendary, drawing beer aficionados from all over the state. David was running the business with a masterful hand. We had built not just a brewery, but a community. The fate of Northwood Brewery was, as we had all predicted, a sad, cautionary tale. With its core recipes cheapened and its experienced production team gone, the quality had plummeted. The loyal customers had abandoned it in droves. After 2 years of hemorrhaging money, Kevin Miller had sold the Northwood brand for pennies on the dollar to a massive, out-of-state beverage conglomerate. They shut down the original brewery, the cathedral of steel I had called home for 2 decades. The name Northwood now existed only on the labels of a bland, mass-produced lager that was brewed in a factory 1,000 miles away. Kevin had taken his father's legacy and sold it for parts. I was in the tap room one quiet Tuesday afternoon, tasting a sample from a new batch, when the door opened. An old, frail man, leaning heavily on a cane, walked in. It took me a moment to recognize him. It was Arthur Miller, the founder of Northwood, Kevin's father. I hadn't seen him since his retirement. I walked over to him. "Arthur," I said softly. "Sam," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. He looked around our bustling, successful tap room. "So, this is it. This is what you've built. It's beautiful. Can I get you a beer?" I asked. "I'd like to try the Ridgeback Amber," he said, his memory still clinging to the old names. "We call it the Cornerstone Pale Ale here," I said with a gentle smile. I poured him a small glass and helped him to a quiet table in the corner. He took a sip, his eyes closing as he savored it. A single tear traced a path through the deep wrinkles on his cheek. "That's it," he whispered. "That's the beer. That's the soul." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a profound, bottomless regret. He was my son, Sam. I thought I was giving him a legacy. Instead, I let him destroy it. "You were the real legacy all along, and I was too blind to see it. I'm sorry." "I know, Arthur," I said, placing a hand on his frail shoulder. He finished his beer, we talked for a little while longer, and then he left. I watched him go, feeling not anger, not even triumph, but a quiet sense of peace. The wound that had been open for so long had finally, definitively, closed. That evening, I stood on the catwalk overlooking my brewhouse. It was humming with the quiet, purposeful energy of a healthy living thing. Maria was overseeing a transfer. David was on the phone finalizing a new distribution deal. My team was happy, the beer was good, and our future was bright. I thought about the concept of revenge. My initial anger at Kevin had been a powerful fuel, but I realized now that the best revenge wasn't watching him fail. The best revenge was succeeding so completely on my own terms that his failure became an irrelevant footnote. It was building something better, something that would last. I walked down to the cellar and pulled a sample of the Doppelbock from the conditioning tank. It was rich, malty, and complex, the taste of patience and integrity. My name was on the building now, but my true legacy wasn't in a name or a brand. It was here, in this glass. It was in the craft itself, in the community we served, and in the quiet pride of a job done right. I had built my own cornerstone, and it was a foundation that would never be broken.